The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier, Akagi, as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo studied the intelligence reports with growing concern. It was June 3, 1942, and the Imperial Japanese Navy's First Air Fleet was steaming toward what would become the most decisive naval engagement in the Pacific theater. The salt spray misted across his weathered face as he contemplated the audacious plan that had been months in the making. 6 months earlier, the attack on Pearl Harbor had stunned the world and seemingly crippled American naval power in the Pacific. The Japanese war machine had rolled across Southeast Asia with unprecedented speed, capturing territory from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. Victory seemed inevitable, and the doctrine of decisive battle that had guided Japanese naval strategy since the Russo-Japanese War appeared vindicated. Yet now, as Nagumo's fleet approached the tiny atoll of Midway, doubts gnawed at the edges of his confidence. The Midway operation, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, represented the apex of Japanese naval ambition. The plan was elegant in its complexity. Lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a trap where superior Japanese forces could annihilate it in one crushing blow. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, formed the backbone of the strike force, carrying over 250 aircraft. Supporting them was a massive armada, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, all converging on the strategic atoll that guarded the approaches to Hawaii. According to historical accounts from the Naval War College Review, the Japanese intelligence apparatus had failed to grasp the true strength of American forces in the Central Pacific, a critical oversight that would prove catastrophic in the coming hours. The assumption that American morale had been shattered by months of defeats blinded Japanese planners to the reality of American resilience and industrial capacity. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, prepared his pilots aboard Akagi with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized that earlier triumph. The Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers were armed and ready, their crews confident in their superior training and equipment. The Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters that would escort them were widely considered the finest carrier-based fighters in the world. Yet beneath the surface, confidence lay troubling signs that Japanese doctrine was beginning to show its limitations. The rapid expansion across the Pacific had stretched supply lines thin, and many of the veteran pilots who had spearheaded the early victories were either dead or exhausted from months of continuous combat. Replacements were less experienced, their training abbreviated by the demands of an accelerating war. The doctrine of decisive battle, which had served Japan well in the more limited conflicts of the past, was being tested on a scale never before imagined. As dawn broke on June 4, 1942, Nagumo received the order to launch the first wave against Midway's airfields. 108 aircraft roared off the carrier decks into the pale morning sky, their engines echoing across the vast expanse of the Pacific. The admiral watched them disappear toward the horizon, unaware that American cryptographers had already broken the Japanese naval code and that 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were positioned to strike at the precise moment when his own carriers would be most vulnerable. The crucible that would test Japanese war doctrine to its breaking point was about to begin. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in the communications center of his Pearl Harbor headquarters, reading the decoded Japanese messages with grim satisfaction. The breaking of the JN-25 naval code had given the Americans an unprecedented advantage. They knew exactly when and where the Japanese fleet would strike. Unlike the chaos of December 7th, this time the United States Navy would be ready. The intelligence coup had been orchestrated by Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptographic team, working around the clock in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters. Their breakthrough had revealed not only the target, Midway, but also the composition and timing of the Japanese attack. Armed with this knowledge, Nimitz had positioned his available forces in what he hoped would be a decisive counter-ambush. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, while Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher led Task Force 17 with the hastily repaired Yorktown. The American force was significantly outnumbered, with only 3 carriers against 4 Japanese flat-tops, but they possessed the crucial advantage of surprise and position. The American doctrine of coordinated strikes by multiple squadrons would be put to its ultimate test against the vaunted Japanese carrier force. On the morning of June 4th, the first phase of the battle unfolded exactly as the intercepted messages had predicted. Japanese aircraft struck Midway Island at 6:30 in the morning, encountering fierce resistance from Marine Corps defenders and Army Air Force bombers. The attack inflicted significant damage on the atoll's facilities, but failed to neutralize it completely, a crucial factor that would soon complicate Japanese planning. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, commanding Marine Aircraft Group 22, on Midway, had prepared his mixed force of fighters and bombers for the inevitable assault. Though outgunned by the superior Japanese Zeros, the Marine pilots fought with desperate courage, knowing that the fate of the Pacific War might hang in the balance. Their sacrifice bought precious time for the approaching American carrier forces. Meanwhile, the first wave of American attacks against the Japanese fleet met with disaster. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, located the Japanese carriers and pressed home their attack despite overwhelming odds. All 15 Devastator torpedo bombers were shot down, with only Ensign George Gay surviving to witness the unfolding battle from his life raft in the water. The squadron's sacrifice seemed to vindicate Japanese claims of aerial superiority, the pattern repeated as other American squadrons found the Japanese fleet. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown suffered similar fates, their obsolete aircraft no match for the Japanese combat air patrol. By 10 o'clock that morning, the American torpedo bomber force had been virtually annihilated, with only 4 aircraft surviving from the 41 that had attacked. Yet the heroic sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had an unintended consequence. They had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. At precisely 10:24 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise spotted the Japanese carriers below, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The moment represented the collision of 2 naval doctrines. The Japanese emphasis on decisive battle had concentrated their most valuable assets, the aircraft carriers, in a single formation, believing that massed firepower would overwhelm any opponent. The American approach, influenced by war games and theoretical studies, emphasized the vulnerability of carriers to coordinated attack and the importance of dispersed formations. As McCluskey's dauntless dive bombers rolled into their attack dives, the Japanese carriers lay exposed and vulnerable, their decks littered with armed aircraft and fuel lines. The carefully orchestrated Japanese plan was about to collide with American determination and superior intelligence, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic reversals in naval history. At 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the war in the Pacific balanced on a knife's edge. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, gazed down at the Japanese carrier formation spread out below, like toys on a vast blue carpet. After hours of searching the empty ocean, running, dangerously low on fuel, he had finally found Admiral Nagumo's mobile force. The timing was perfect, and perfectly catastrophic for the Japanese. The carrier's flight decks were crowded with aircraft being hastily rearmed for a second strike against Midway. Fuel lines snaked across the wooden decks, and ordnance was stacked everywhere as maintenance crews worked frantically to prepare for the next launch. The doctrine of keeping maximum firepower concentrated on the flight decks, which had served the Japanese well in their string of early victories, now became a fatal vulnerability. McCluskey split his force, leading one group against the flagship Akagi, while Lieutenant Richard Best's section targeted the Kaga. At the same moment, entirely by coincidence, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's bombers from Yorktown arrived over the same target area, having taken a different route to find the Japanese fleet. The convergence of 2 separate American attack groups represented the kind of coordinated strike that American naval doctrine had long theorized but never achieved under combat conditions. The first bomb struck Akagi's flight deck at 10:26 a.m., penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among stored aircraft and fuel. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as aviation gasoline ignited, creating an inferno that quickly spread beyond control. On the bridge, Admiral Nagumo watched in horror as his flagship, the veteran of Pearl Harbor and the conquests across Southeast Asia, became a blazing pyre. Lieutenant Best's attack on Kaga proved equally devastating. His 1,000-pound bomb struck the carrier near the bridge, starting fires that quickly engulfed the forward section of the ship. A second bomb hit among the aircraft on the flight deck, creating another conflagration that merged with the first. Within minutes, Kaga was transformed from a proud warship into a floating furnace, her crew abandoning ship as explosions racked her hull. Simultaneously, Leslie's bombers from Yorktown struck the carrier Soryu with similar results. 3 direct hits in rapid succession turned the ship into an inferno, her magazines detonating in spectacular explosions that could be seen for miles. In the space of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 aircraft carriers in the mobile force had been reduced to burning wrecks, their carefully trained air crews dead or dying in the flames. The speed and completeness of the disaster stunned the Japanese command structure. Captain Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from the bridge of Hiryu, found himself the senior Japanese officer still capable of offensive action. The doctrine of decisive battle now worked against the Japanese. Having concentrated their best forces in a single formation, they had lost 3/4 of their striking power in minutes. Yamaguchi immediately launched a counterattack with the 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters that Hiryu still had operational. Led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, the attack group located the American Task Force 17 and struck the carrier Yorktown with 3 bomb hits. The American carrier, already damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea and hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor, began listing heavily and appeared to be sinking. The successful attack on Yorktown provided a brief moment of hope for the Japanese forces, suggesting that their doctrine of aggressive offense might still prevail. However, the loss of 3 carriers had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. The Japanese had entered the battle with a 2-to-1 advantage in carrier strength. Now they faced 2 undamaged American carriers, with only 1 operational Japanese flat top. As the afternoon sun climbed higher over the Pacific, the burning hulks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu bore witness to the fundamental flaw in Japanese naval doctrine. The emphasis on concentrating maximum force for a decisive blow had made their fleet devastatingly effective in offense, but fatally vulnerable to coordinated counterattack. The Americans, guided by their intelligence advantage and a doctrine that emphasized survivability as much as striking power, had achieved a reversal that would reshape the entire course of the Pacific War. Captain Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of Hiryu, the only Japanese aircraft carrier still capable of flight operations, watching the smoke columns from his burning sister ships stain the azure Pacific sky. The afternoon of June 4, 1942, had transformed from triumph to catastrophe in the span of hours, but Yamaguchi, known throughout the Imperial Navy as one of its most aggressive and capable commanders, was far from finished. The IEA's destruction of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as a dominant force, but Yamaguchi embodied the samurai spirit that had driven Japanese naval doctrine since the Meiji Restoration. Rather than retreat, he prepared to launch every available aircraft in a final, desperate attempt to salvage victory from disaster. His remaining air group consisted of only 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters, but Japanese doctrine had always emphasized that a determined attack by skilled pilots could overcome numerical disadvantages. At 2:45 p.m., Yamaguchi launched his second and final strike of the day. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, already wounded from the morning attack on Midway, led the small formation toward the American task force despite his injuries. This embodied the spirit of Bushido that permeated Japanese military culture, the willingness to sacrifice individual lives for the greater glory of the empire and the emperor. The attack located the damaged Yorktown, which had been abandoned by her crew but was being reboarded by damage control parties. 2 torpedo hits struck the carrier on her port side, causing massive flooding and a severe list that finally forced her complete abandonment. To the Japanese pilots, it appeared they had sunk a second American carrier, partially balancing the scales of the morning's disaster. However, American intelligence and doctrine had prepared for exactly this situation. Unlike the Japanese, who had concentrated their carriers in a single formation, the Americans had maintained separate task forces that could operate independently. The loss of Yorktown, while painful, still left Enterprise and Hornet fully operational and thirsting for revenge. At 5:00 p.m., 24 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, located the Solitary. "Hear you." The Japanese carrier, having launched her last strike, was attempting to recover her aircraft when the American bombers struck. 4 direct hits transformed Japan's final operational carrier into another funeral pyre, her flight deck collapsing into the hangar spaces below. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive account of the Pacific War, Yamaguchi's decision to remain with his ship represented the ultimate expression of Japanese naval honor, but also highlighted the inflexibility that would increasingly characterize Japanese responses to strategic setbacks. As Hiryu settled deeper into the water, Yamaguchi made the decision that would make him a legend in Japanese naval history. Refusing all entreaties to abandon ship, he chose to go down with his vessel, embodying the samurai code that death was preferable to defeat. His final message to Admiral Yamamoto was characteristically direct. "I am prepared to crash dive into an enemy carrier if the opportunity presents itself." The captain's sacrifice epitomized both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of Japanese military culture. The willingness to die rather than accept defeat had made Japanese forces formidable opponents throughout the early months of the war, but it also prevented the kind of strategic flexibility that might have allowed Japan to adapt to changing circumstances. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese aircraft carriers lay burning or sunk beneath the waves. With them died not only thousands of irreplaceable pilots and crew members, but the doctrine of decisive battle that had guided Japanese naval strategy for nearly half a century. The rising sun had reached its zenith at Pearl Harbor. At Midway, it began its long descent toward final eclipse. The American forces, guided by superior intelligence and a more flexible doctrine, had achieved complete tactical victory. But the strategic implications would take months to fully manifest as both sides grappled with the consequences of this pivotal encounter. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his cabin aboard the battleship Yamato, 300 miles northwest of the Midway battlefield, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his carefully planned operation. The radio reports streaming in throughout the afternoon of June 4, 1942, painted a picture of such complete reversal that he initially refused to believe them. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned that Japan could run wild for only 6 months to a year, was witnessing the validation of his own prophecy. The combined fleet commander had positioned himself with the main force, including 7 battleships and multiple cruiser and destroyer squadrons, ready to deliver the final blow once the aircraft carriers had eliminated American naval aviation. The doctrine of decisive battle, refined through decades of war games and theoretical study, called for the carriers to weaken the enemy before the battle line delivered the coup de grace. Instead, Yamamoto found himself commanding a force rendered strategically irrelevant by the loss of its striking arm. The first reports from Admiral Nagumo had been confusing and contradictory. The attack on Midway had proceeded as planned, but American resistance had been fiercer than expected. Then came fragmentary reports of American air attacks, followed by ominous silence from the mobile force. By mid-afternoon, the full scope of the catastrophe became clear. All 4 fleet carriers were either sunk or sinking, taking with them the cream of Japanese naval aviation. Yamamoto faced a decision that would define his legacy and potentially alter the course of the Pacific War. The main force still possessed overwhelming surface superiority. His 7 battleships alone outgunned anything the Americans could bring to bear. Japanese doctrine suggested that he should press forward, seeking the decisive surface engagement that had been the ultimate goal of the operation. Yet without air cover, his massive ships would be sitting targets for American land-based and carrier aircraft. The Admiral's Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, advocated for continuing the attack despite the carrier losses. The bombardment force, led by the cruisers Kumano, Suzuya, Mikuma, and Mogami, was still approaching Midway, and could potentially neutralize the airfield, opening the way for the main force to engage any remaining American surface units. This represented traditional Japanese naval thinking, the belief that superior fighting spirit and heavier guns could overcome tactical disadvantages. However, Yamamoto's strategic vision had always been broader than that of his subordinates. He understood that Japan's industrial capacity could not sustain a prolonged war of attrition with the United States. The Midway operation had been conceived as a knockout blow that would force America to negotiate a favorable peace. With the loss of 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers and their equally irreplaceable air groups, that strategic objective had become impossible to achieve. At 7:00 p.m. on June 4th, Yamamoto made the most difficult decision of his naval career. Signal flags fluttered up Yamato's halyards, transmitting the order that would haunt Japanese naval planners for the remainder of the war. Retire. The combined fleet, the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled, turned away from Midway without firing a single shot in anger. The decision to retreat represented a fundamental shift in Japanese naval thinking. For the first time since the Russo-Japanese War, a Japanese fleet had withdrawn from battle without achieving its objectives. The doctrine of decisive battle, which had guided Imperial Navy strategy since Admiral Heihachiro Togo's victory at Tsushima in 1905, had been tested and found wanting against American industrial might and tactical innovation. The withdrawal did not proceed without cost. The heavy cruisers Mikuma and Mogami, damaged in a collision during the retirement, fell victim to American air attacks the following day. Mikuma was sunk and Mogami severely damaged, adding to the toll of Yamamoto's first strategic defeat. The losses emphasized the vulnerability of surface ships operating without air cover, a lesson that would be repeated throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. As Yamato steamed westward through the pre-dawn darkness of June 5th, Yamamoto composed his report to Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo. The man who had orchestrated Japan's greatest naval triumph was now forced to explain its most catastrophic defeat. The rising sun that had burned so brightly over Pearl Harbor had been eclipsed in the skies above Midway, and the long twilight of Japanese naval power had begun. The news of the Midway disaster reached Tokyo on June 5, 1942, like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Emperor Hirohito, accustomed to receiving reports of victory after victory, listened in stunned silence as Navy Minister Admiral Shigetaro Shimada delivered the catastrophic tally. 4 aircraft carriers sunk, over 3,000 casualties, and Japan's elite naval air arm virtually eliminated. The defeat represented not merely a tactical setback, but a fundamental challenge to the doctrine that had guided Japanese strategy since the restoration of imperial rule. In the halls of the Naval General Staff, senior officers struggled to comprehend how their carefully planned operation had resulted in such complete reversal. The doctrine of decisive battle, which had served Japan well against Russia nearly 4 decades earlier, had assumed that superior training and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Midway demonstrated that in the age of industrial warfare, intelligence, logistics, and productive capacity mattered more than Bushido and tactical brilliance. The American victory at Midway represented the triumph of a different naval philosophy. Rather than seeking a single decisive engagement, American doctrine emphasized attrition, industrial production, and the systematic degradation of enemy capabilities. The 3 American carriers that had emerged victorious from the battle were merely the first of dozens that would roll off American shipyards in the coming months. Japan, with its limited industrial base and shrinking pool of experienced pilots, could not hope to match such production. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, understood the strategic implications immediately. The victory had not only eliminated Japan's primary offensive capability, but had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. With Japanese carrier strength crippled, American forces could begin the long march across the central Pacific toward the Japanese home islands. The human cost of Japan's defeat extended far beyond the ships and aircraft lost in battle. The destruction of the mobile force had eliminated many of Japan's most experienced pilots, men who had trained for years and whose skills could not be quickly replaced. The doctrine of using elite pilots in continuous combat, rather than rotating them home to train new aviators, had created a cadre of exceptional airmen but also made their loss catastrophic for Japanese naval aviation. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, survived Midway aboard the burning Akagi, and would later write that the battle marked the moment when Japan lost the war. The offensive capability that had swept across the Pacific in 6 months of stunning victories had been broken in 5 minutes of American dive bombing, and no amount of fighting spirit could resurrect the dead or replace the irreplaceable carriers. The strategic consequences of Midway rippled across the Pacific theater and beyond. Japanese forces, which had seemed unstoppable just days earlier, were suddenly on the defensive. The planned invasion of Australia was quietly shelved, and resources that might have been used for further expansion were diverted to defensive preparations. The initiative in the Pacific War had passed permanently to the Americans. For the United States, Midway represented vindication of the intelligence revolution that had begun with the breaking of Japanese diplomatic codes before Pearl Harbor. The victory demonstrated that technological superiority and superior information could overcome numerical disadvantages and tactical surprise. American cryptographers had achieved what battleships and bombers could not. They had penetrated the fog of war and illuminated Japanese intentions with devastating clarity. The battle's aftermath also highlighted the contrasting approaches to casualty reporting and public information. While American newspapers trumpeted the victory and honored the fallen, Japanese authorities initially suppressed news of the defeat, maintaining the fiction of invincibility even as they scrambled to rebuild their shattered naval aviation capability. This difference in transparency would become a recurring theme as the war progressed and Japanese defeats mounted. As the sun set on June 6, 1942, the Pacific War entered a new phase. The period of Japanese expansion was over, ended not by a single climactic battle, but by the methodical application of American industrial might and tactical innovation. The doctrine of decisive battle had been tested in the crucible of Midway and found wanting, replaced by a new reality where victory would go to the side that could best sustain and supply its forces across the vast reaches of the Pacific Ocean. The tide of war had turned forever, and with it, the destiny of nations hung in the balance of a transformed strategic landscape.